Today, we're going to go back to 1965. We're in Chicago, and life is in this really weird in between stage of a lot of massive changes in civil rights, music is changing, and someone's baby has just gone missing from the Michael Reese Hospital. Literally a day old baby. A woman walked in pretending to be a nurse. She had one task: kidnap a baby. And she did. She just took a baby, lied that this baby needed some extra exams, and the mom willingly gave her the baby. This was a time period where babies were usually kept in nurseries after the mom would give birth, so it wasn't that odd that her baby disappeared. Only eventually staff noticed that this baby was gone and was missing. But luckily, 2 years later, this baby, Paul, was found, and he was returned to his parents, Dora and Chester. And life would just go on normally, except Paul always felt different. He always felt like he wasn't his parents' son, and not in that angsty teenage way where you're like, you're not my family, but they are. He just always felt like he was searching for something. When he was older and he had a daughter, and DNA testing was more normal. And you know when those DNA kits were kind of popping around in like 2012, where you would like swab your cheek or like spit in a tube and white people would find out that they are in fact white?
So, ancestry composition, European? I'm European! Oh my god!
That's what Paul was using. And he would find out he was, in fact, not their son. So who the hell was Paul? Where was the real Paul that went missing? And believe me, this story is crazy. This is not just a guy finds out he's not their son and then he ends up finding his family. There is a lot of craziness. It was almost like the more answers he had, the more questions he had. Even the mafia is in this. This is the story of Paul Fronczak. Before we continue, let me introduce you to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we talk about all sorts of things that are kind of true crime adjacent. Today, there will be themes of abuse, kidnapping, child neglect, the mafia, if that is something that you're not wanting to hear. Totally get it. If you are interested in hearing more about this case, please check out Paul's podcast, The Fronczak Files. It's actually still active today. Like, he's still posting today. He goes into way more detail than I'm gonna go into this episode. And he also has a blog, he has a book. He also has a documentary that is on Amazon, I'm pretty sure. I'll have everything linked down below, but please check it out. Let's kind of go back to when Paul found out he was indeed kidnapped. Paul was 10 years old, and he was like any other 10-year-old. He wanted to know what he was going to get for Christmas, and he knew just where to look. There was a little crawl space behind a sofa, and so he moves the sofa, he kind of goes in there, trying to see what he can find for Christmas. I mean, I don't really know what boys had in the 70s, but he was excited. So he found a few boxes, and in one of the boxes was some newspaper clippings. And he recognized the people inside the newspaper clippings. It was him and his parents. These clippings said, "Baby stolen at hospital. Mother asks kidnapper to return baby." And also mentioning baby was found and this was a cool break. And Paul was like, what? He had no idea that this happened. So he went up to his mom and he was kind of like, what is this? Like, what do you mean I was kidnapped? Now, his mom was definitely the kind of mom that was like, I'm going to explain this to you and then you're never going to ask me any questions. And so Paul kind of knew that. So this is what happened. Dora would give birth to Paul on April 26, 1965, at the Michael Reese Hospital all the way in Chicago. Everything was normal, a normal day, a normal birth, everything was going well. The following day is when a nurse stopped by in Dora's room and told Dora that Paul just needed extra exams done and that she would bring him back. Obviously, Dora is not thinking this is a kidnapper, so she hands her the baby. This was a time period, like I mentioned earlier, where babies were kept in a nursery and moms would usually just rest up. So it wasn't unusual for Dora that she didn't see her child, her baby, her 1 day old baby for a while. And then the staff noticed that, hey, we can't find Paul. So they start looking and they're like, oh shit. They end up actually calling Chester while he was at work. I can't imagine, first of all, being Chester and getting a call from the hospital, because you would probably think the safest place for your child is the hospital, but I guess not. And I can't also imagine being the nurse in this moment and like having to make that call to be like, hey, we can't find your son. Where does a baby go? How does a baby just end up kidnapped or taken? This became a massive sensation. There was over 200 police officers and the FBI looking for baby Paul. They were going around everywhere. They were interviewing people in the hospital. They were checking houses. I'm sure, like, anyone who had a newborn at this time was probably scared because, you know, what if someone comes up to you and is like, is that for sure your child? And you're probably like, yes. That would have been so scary. So Dora and Chester ended up staying in the hospital for about a week, waiting to see if Paul would show up, I guess, or if the kidnapper would, you know, maybe drop him back off, but nothing. So after a week, they would have to go home, and this was hell. Not only was Dora dealing with the grief of losing her son, and this is a completely different grief. I don't know how many people can relate to Dora and be like, oh yeah, I remember when my son was kidnapped. This isn't really like the same thing as someone who ends up having complications in birth or something. And on top of this, they were dealing with the media hounding them and going up to her, talking to her. And obviously they were making a lot of appearances being like, "Hey, kidnapper, please return her baby," but obviously nothing happened. Until 2 years later, all the way in New Jersey, a toddler was found abandoned in a stroller in the middle of a shopping center. But to make this all worse, this baby had a black eye. And so he was immediately taken into the custody of the police and taken into foster care. But because this sensation of Paul was so massive in that area, a lot of the police kind of knew about it, obviously. And so they were like, well, he kind of looks similar. Now, they didn't have DNA testing, and they literally had to go off vibes alone. They had to go off his nose. Literally, they only had one photo of Paul. No offense to any newborns out there, but newborns don't typically have that much of a look to them. They all kind of look fairly similar. Obviously, they'll have unique traits to them, but they were just going off one grainy photo, and they were like, well, this toddler looks kind of like this baby. And so they ended up calling Dora and Chester, and they were like, hey, we have this toddler. Maybe you should come and check him out, because they had been testing over 10,000 boys that could have been Paul, and they never ruled out this little boy. Now, this little boy was now named Scott. So Dora and Chester went down to New Jersey to visit Scott. And at first, they actually had to do a multiple tests to make sure that they were able to adopt this baby if this was going to be Paul. And everything was cleared. And then when Dora finally met up with this baby, she just felt an immediate connection to Paul. She was like, this is Paul, this is my son, oh my God. It was like a mother instinct, and everybody was so happy. They were like, this is a win. We found the missing toddler, the missing baby. Everything's good. And they would go on to adopt Paul. And Paul would go on to have a pretty normal, loving family. You know, they were definitely a little bit more traditional and Catholic, but they were a great family. Now, I don't really know when she was ever going to tell Paul he was kidnapped, or if she was waiting until he was an adult, or if she was ever going to do it. But after she told Paul, hey, that's what happened, but she was pretty much like, now we don't talk about it and you don't mention it ever again. And he wasn't really ever allowed to ask questions or even process the emotions. And I mean, like, what do you really do? Especially in this time period. This isn't like it is now. I feel like now Paul would probably get on TikTok and make a video being like, hey guys, this is who I was. And maybe he'd be able to communicate it, but obviously he wasn't allowed to. Paul did grow up a little bit different than his family. He didn't really look like them, but still similar enough, I guess you could say. He was a little bit of a rebel. He was forced into Catholic school. He was really into the devil's music, rock and roll. He actually started to grow his hair out, like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Metallica. And actually, this caused a huge fight with him and his mom, Dora. And she said something that was pretty cruel to him. And she said, I wish they never found you, which is very harsh, especially over hair. But all I know for Paul is he said this is something that really hurt him. Although I don't know if she was really meaning to say something that harsh, if she was just in a moment. I know for a lot of parents in that time, they really were afraid of Pink Floyd. So, anyways, after Paul graduated high school, he ended up traveling with his band for a few years. And Paul was always kind of on the run. He was the type of son that never really called his parents. You would be lucky if you heard from him. He did that for a bit, then they broke up. So then he ended up joining the army for about a year. Then he did sales. And then he became a model and an actor. And that is pretty much what he kind of has been doing. He never really felt like he fit in with his family, unlike his brother Dave, who really just got along with his family. And for Paul, he just always felt like there was just something about him that was different. And eventually, Paul would end up settling down and living in Las Vegas, and he would end up meeting his wife at the time, Michelle. And in 2008, they were expecting a little girl named Emma. And that's when things changed for Paul, probably because the fact that he had a little girl now. And also, he said that a doctor would ask for their family medical history, and Paul realized he didn't know, and he was embarrassed about it. And so that's when this became more serious to him, and he really wanted to know more about his family. DNA testing didn't start to become a thing until the 80s, and it wasn't until like the late 80s when it was becoming a little bit more used. So obviously, Paul was never tested when he was a child, and I'm sure his parents just never thought to do it or didn't want to. And I think maybe for Paul, he never thought of it, but now he has a little girl and his life is changing, and he's probably thinking more about it, and maybe it's all like bubbling up. When you kind of push it down for so long, it eventually comes out. He was really wanting to do one of those DNA kits, but he never wanted to hurt his parents because he never wanted to be like, hey, do you actually think I'm your son? He just didn't want to hurt their feelings. But in 2012, he finally decided to. He came across a DNA kit called IdentiGen, something that you just swab your cheek and you place it in a tube and you send it off, the whole shtick. And so he ended up buying a couple of those, and his parents came to Las Vegas from Chicago. And while they were all eating, Paul kind of pulled out a little sneaky, and he just pulled out the kits and was like, hey, do you ever want to find out if I'm actually your son? And his parents were pretty much put on the spot, were probably uncomfortable, but probably didn't know what to say in the moment. So they said, sure. Everything seemed fine. Paul would end up driving his parents back to the airport, and when they finally got home, they would end up calling Paul and saying, hey, please do not send this out. This is a waste of time, a waste of money. You are our son. Get over it, essentially. And so Paul did agree. He respected his parents to not send it, but he did keep the kits. And after a few weeks, he just wanted to know the truth. He needed to know if he was really their son, but he also wanted to know if he wasn't, where was the real Paul? So after he sent them, a few weeks later, he would receive a call. He was 100% not their son. And this was not a win for Paul. This was not a, I told you so. Paul would describe it as, I just felt like my life as I knew it ended. I felt the color drain from my face. I couldn't think. I got all sweaty. Everything I knew about myself, my birthday, my medical history, being Polish, Catholic, even being a tourist, went out the window, and for a second, I didn't know who I was. So if Paul isn't Paul, then who is he, and where is the real Paul? So before Paul would even contact his parents, he actually had contacted a journalist named George Knapp. This journalist wanted to help Paul out. And this ended up blowing up across the country. Because, I mean, this is a crazy story. And Paul did not tell his parents right away, which definitely probably should have contacted them before he reached out. But I also think that he just maybe didn't think it would blow up. And so he would receive a call from his parents and they were hurt. They told him that they were angry. They couldn't believe he did this. They ended up not talking to him for a couple years because of this. But Paul really wanted his parents to know he didn't do this as a gotcha. He wanted them to find out the truth about their missing son. And that is why he contacted the media. Paul was doing a lot of different interviews. He was on a radio show. He also did a 2020 interview with Barbara Walters. And so George actually set up a Facebook group called Who is Paul Fronczak? And this was actually one of the ways Paul would find out more about who he was. It all goes back to Facebook. So one day while this episode of the radio show was on, someone was listening to it, and that was Cece Moore. Cece Moore is one of the top genealogists. She is like a celebrity in this DNA world. She's been on Finding Your Roots. She's also helped many people find their biological parents. She's also put a lot of rapists and criminals behind bars. She is very incredibly talented at what she does. I don't know how she does it. So in 2013, she ended up contacting Paul through Facebook. But since Paul was receiving a lot of emails and just interviews and all this stuff, he actually didn't see her message for a few days. And then he finally got back to her and they decided to work together. So Cece works with a bunch of volunteers called the DNA Detectives, which I freaking love that name. So they took on this case for free and they used a mixture of DNA testings, newspapers, public records, and social media and just like phone calls. And that is how they were able to track his family. It was very hard. This was not a thing where they just did a couple of Google searches or Facebook searches and found his family. They actually had to build his DNA, like his family tree up, because there was none. So he was uploading a lot of his DNA to the three databases of Ancestry, 23andMe, and Family Tree. At the time of this case, they were a lot smaller than what they are now. So there wasn't a whole lot for them to go off of. But as they continued doing this, they would actually be able to find that his ancestral roots revealed that he was Jewish. And so it was getting closer. And after a couple years, on June 3rd, 2015, Cece Moore called Paul and she just said to him, "What do you think of the name Jack?" And Paul thought it was a sharp name. It was a cool name. And so she would tell him, "We found out that your name is Jack Rosenthal." He was 6 months older than what he actually was. He was born on October 27th, 1963, and his family was living in New Jersey. But that wasn't all. He was a twin. He had a sister named Jill, which, can we just pause? Jack and Jill for twins is very cute. I just love that. But finding Jill was going to be a mystery. And this isn't even close to where this story ends up because, oh my god, this was going to affect Paul in so many ways. Unfortunately, with him becoming very hyper focused on this, it did end up destroying his marriage because he was putting everything into finding him and finding the real Paul and now finding his sister, that he wasn't really paying attention to his wife and they just ended up getting a divorce because I think his wife was pretty much in the mindset of, why does it matter? I'm your family now. But unfortunately, this was just taking up so much of Paul's mind. You know, when you kind of are looking or searching for something and you feel like you're so close, but you're so far away? I think that's probably what was happening for Paul. Now, I think he's still on good terms with his ex-wife. I don't really know exactly, but I do know that he has a good relationship with his daughter. So it's not like he was just some shitty husband and father and just moved on with his life. Like, he definitely still has a great relationship with them. So he would end up finding out that his family was very musical, which made a lot of sense because Paul was a very musical person. He was in a band, and this was something that was just natural to him. And his adopted family, they were not like that. But he would find out his biological family, they were just very musical. But his family had a dark past as well. His parents were extremely neglectful and very abusive, and they passed on in the 90s, so he was never able to meet them. His mom, Marie, was an alcoholic, and his dad, Gilbert, was a veteran who had PTSD from the Korean War, who was extremely violent and just not a kind man at all. Both Jack and Jill were extremely neglected. They were abused, placed in cages. They were more like makeshift cribs, is what I think they were, but they definitely were just very neglected. And Paul did have other siblings, but they were all taken care of. But Jack and Jill, for some reason, were just extremely abused. And nobody knew what happened to them. His cousins mentioned that they knew about him and his sister Jill, and then one day they just were gone. And they were just told that, oh, they went to a different family member or they were adopted to another family, and no one really questioned it. So, the only person that we actually know that did kind of know a little bit about Jill and Jack was his babysitter. Her name was Susan Ward. She was actually watching TV once and she saw this case come up, and so she was actually able to contact Paul and share her story. So, Susan's story is like pretty interesting. So, she was just shy of turning 15 in the spring of 1965 in Atlantic City. She used to babysit for a lot of the families in the neighborhood, and this neighborhood was ran by the mafia. One of the mob leaders was actually living in this neighborhood. But despite that, it was very safe. Like, people would leave their cars unlocked, they would leave their houses open, and everybody was just pretty chill. I don't know if it's just because they had such a mafia surveillance that maybe that's why everyone was safe because they didn't have to worry, or what. But they pretty much were all like, I got you, you got me. And at the time, a lot of the teens would just do what they were told, and this was just common in the 60s as well. But they also would just do odd jobs here and there for a lot of people in the neighborhood, and one of that was babysitting. Susan was babysitting for a family that lived in kind of a townhouse right next door to Marie and Gilbert. And so one day, while she was leaving a babysitting gig, Marie was outside with her two daughters, and she stopped Susan and said, "Hey, do you think you could babysit for me?" And Susan agreed. And I mean, she was just going to make some extra cash, even though she didn't really know this woman. I mean, I know it's a lot different now, but she was just like, sure. So it was going to be an overnight babysitting gig. And she was told that the two girls that were in the basement or in the main floor could eat whatever they wanted, watch whatever they wanted, and do whatever, and that they would be back in the morning. But they told Susan, don't bother about the twins upstairs, they've been taken care of. This confused Susan because she didn't know that this woman had twins. I think she thought that the two little girls were twins, and she was confused when this woman just says, don't worry about the twins, and just leaves. They're gonna be gone all night, so obviously she's thinking that's really weird. Now, like I said, a lot of teens at this time and just people in general, you just listened to what adults said and you just didn't go against it. But obviously, for Susan, she had a moral compass and something was telling her she needed to go and check on those twins. So she actually ended up calling her sister and asking her sister if she could watch over the girls while she goes upstairs to check on these twins. And so while she was going upstairs, she did not know that this was going to change her life. When she walked into the room, the first thing that she noticed was the fact that the smell was awful. And not just like two twins used their diapers, but in that dirty, neglectful, rotten smell, she noticed was that Jack and Jill were in their own cribs on separate sides of the room, pretty apart, which is pretty odd. Usually twins are kept fairly close to each other. The first twin she noticed was Jack, and he had a black eye. He was terrified of her. He was so scared. He was backing into his crib, cowering away from her. She noticed that there was rotten milk in their cribs and in their little milk bottles, and it was so clear that they were extremely neglected. Jill was on the other side, and she saw that she was very skinny and frail, and she would not cry. Susan didn't know if Jill was just super skinny because she was a little girl or if it was because she was being neglected, but it did seem that it was the latter. They both would not cry, but they would just stare at Susan with these like wide eyes of, I'm so afraid of you, who are you? She would talk to them in a soft voice, kind of sticking her hand out to kind of touch them very carefully. And when she would touch them gently, they were cowering away from her, but when they would feel her soft touch, they were just shocked. They did not know why they were being treated with such kindness. So she would end up picking them up and giving them a bath, and she noted that there was a lot of sores on their butt, probably from the fact that they were not being changed. She would clean them, and then she would clean out their dirty bottles and give them fresh milk. And when they had their milk, they were shocked that they were being fed, which is just so devastating and so sad. One thing Susan found really weird was that the girls downstairs looked like two completely different families in the sense that they were taken care of, they were fed, they were healthy, they had clean clothes, everything seemed normal. And then these twins were just locked away in their room, being treated just like nothing. So there was no place for Susan to actually call for child abuse. And also, she's just 14, 15. It's not like she knew much of what to do. But what she did know is that this was incredibly wrong. And she knew that Gilbert and Marie were probably going to be pretty upset with her, but she just knew she had to. In the morning when they came back, they smelled like booze, and Susan told them like, "Hey, the twins upstairs, I changed their diapers and I cleaned them and I fed them." You know, maybe thinking that these parents are just struggling, maybe they just needed help, but they were pissed at her. They were mad that she went against her wishes. She said that Gilbert was very scary, and she didn't really know why. She said he just had a scary demeanor about him, and so they just told her that she needed to leave. And so she left and went home, and she told her mom, but her mom told her that it wasn't their business and that they needed to just move on, which definitely a different time. She never saw the twins again. She would babysit for the same neighbor, and she would ask this neighbor what happened to Jack and Jill, and the neighbor would say, "Oh, they were sent off to a family member, or they were sent to different areas in the States, or something like that." And so she never knew what happened to them, but it always bothered her. It wasn't until years and decades later when she finally was able to get in contact with Paul. She even tried contacting the FBI, but nobody would get back to her. And she actually tried contacting that neighbor because the neighbor still lived in the same area, but that neighbor would never talk to her or tell her anything. And she was kind of just like, what can I do? So there's a lot of theories stemming from why everyone was sketchy about Jack and Jill and why no one did anything. And the main thing is that it was a mafia ran neighborhood. A lot of people thought that maybe Gilbert had connections to the mob, or maybe he was in debt to them or something, because it's just so odd that everybody was weird about it. You know, maybe back then it would make sense that nobody's saying anything, but now you would think people would be like, "Oh yeah, that was really weird that that happened. It's because of this." But still, no one would say anything. And it's actually even weird because Paul got in contact with his siblings and he was supposed to meet with them, and then they just ghosted him saying, "Do not contact us." And I mean, this can happen to anyone. When you go to meet your biological family, sometimes you have to, that's a risk where they don't want to see you. But they were really odd about it in a way. Like they were just like, "Stay away from us, don't contact us." I just think it's very odd and weird. So Paul does have a theory of what he thinks might have happened to Jill. He thinks that maybe his parents tried to get rid of Jill and that maybe they got rid of both of them, or that something happened to Jill, that maybe they hurt her and they didn't know what to do with Jack, and so they just left him in that busy shopping mall knowing that somebody would find him, because it's easier to explain why both twins are gone and not just one. But it's hard to know exactly where Jill is or if she is even alive or what happened. After 2 years of this craziness, Paul did reconnect with his mom and his dad, and his mom had been through a lot, and Paul knew that. And not only did she lose her son, but she was also blaming herself. And in his mom's defense, she said that when she first saw Paul, she didn't know if it was really Paul, but she said, like, when she looked at him, she could not send him back to the system because the system is awful, especially in the 60s. And so I think it makes sense why she did that. I think that maybe she was just hoping that by a rare chance that this was her son, and I think that she just didn't want to admit it, and maybe she just didn't want to deal with it, and that's why she got so angry at Paul when he did the DNA test, because it just brought all of that back. So Paul now has to find Jill, and he has to find the real Paul. The real Paul was located through Facebook, of all places. Cece was actually given a tip and was able to use a cousin's DNA to track down the real Paul's daughter. He was found living in Michigan in 2019, going by the name Kevin Beatty. He grew up in Michigan. He lived a normal life. He played basketball in high school. He ended up getting married a few times, had 3 daughters, and worked in a mechanic shop. Kevin went his entire life not knowing he was kidnapped by that nurse. Unfortunately for Kevin, he did die of cancer in 2020. And he did have a few phone calls with Dora, but because of his cancer and also COVID in 2020, he was never able to meet her. But he did build up a few phone calls. But the FBI, to this very day, are still investigating this case, because how does someone pose as a nurse and then just hijack a baby in plain sight? So, Kevin, growing up, did not have the same last name as his parents. His parents were Robert and Lorraine Fountain, but he went by Kevin Ray Beatty. And nobody ever kind of clocked the two. His mom was quite shady. She had been married a few times, which that doesn't make her shady, but she was in prison in the 50s. She was lying about her age, her race. Apparently, she was black on her marriage certificate, which I don't know why she would have that. It seems like Lorraine was dating a doctor at that hospital at the time of the kidnapping. And then that she moved to Arkansas for a little bit. And then when she came back to Michigan, she just had a baby and ended up marrying Robert. So maybe that's why Kevin had a different last name. But there is a theory that Lorraine was not the woman who actually did the kidnapping. Apparently, Lorraine was a sex worker who was very highly priced and had connections to the Chicago mob. But she was not the only sex worker who is into this. So Paul and a few of the DNA volunteers, they believed that another woman named Alice Beatty, who was also the sex worker, was the one who did the kidnapping. At the time, babies were high in demand in the black market. So this is what the theory is. Alice worked as a sex worker with the mob, and she was given a task: cosplay as a nurse and kidnap a baby. Apparently, whoever is going to buy this baby will pay a lot of money. Maybe Alice was going to receive extra pay for this. It seems that she was given traits to look for, because a lot of moms at the hospital, when they were interviewed, they said a woman was kind of looking at different babies and just checking them out. So maybe she was told that they need to have a specific look. So Alice then went to Dora's hospital room, said that baby Paul needed to have some exams, and then she just left with baby Paul and vanished like a ghost. Because this became such a widespread story, it seems that whoever was going to buy the baby decided to back out, and the mob did not expect this. So they told Alice to go somewhere and lay low while this dies down. So she flew to Arkansas with baby Paul, and then she was waiting for the heat to die down, but I think like there was no one wanting to take the baby. So it seems that she went up to Lorraine and pleaded with her to take baby Paul and keep him. And so Lorraine flew back to Michigan and raised Kevin as if he was her son or was this adopted baby or something like that. This is all a theory, though. We don't really know exactly what happened. The police to this very day are still looking into who kidnapped baby Paul. And Lorraine did pass in 2004, and Alice also passed on, so it's not even like they can talk to them. According to Kevin's daughters, their grandma was a great grandma. She was kind. And I mean, I don't know if maybe she was shady in the beginning part of her life, and then maybe she went on to be a good mom, or maybe that's copium. I don't know. There is no way for us to tell if these women were a part of it, though, because they were sex workers and working for the mob, so they could have been like, forced to do this. Also, they would be like the easiest scapegoat because they're sex workers and people just treat sex workers like shit, so they would be the easiest to throw to the wolves essentially. Jill, to this very day, still has not been found. Nobody knows where she is or if she is even alive. Paul does have a lot of hope that he will find her, and I really do hope he does. Whether he finds where she is, maybe she's just off living her life and doesn't know, or maybe he finds closure of what happened to his sister. Paul has gone on to talk a lot about this in different forms of media, his documentary, his blog, he's written books, and he also has his podcast, The Fronczak Files, which goes into a lot more detailed hour-long episodes. He interviews a lot of the people, and that is where I got a lot of my information. So if you're curious, please check that out. I think his podcast is quite entertaining. Paul is pretty funny, and honestly, I think if you're interested in this type of stuff, give it a listen. I will be putting all the information down in the description below, along with the contact information if anyone does have any information on Jill or anything. So please check that out. And that is where we're at for today's episode. Thank you again for listening. Again, I meant no harm to Paul or his family or even Kevin or anyone who's been affected by this case. And I really hope that Paul is able to get some closure. We do have a Google form if you have a case or topic you would like us to discuss. But again, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you guys next week. Bye!